Welcome everyone to our last panel for the day as a part of the annual symposium titled Forests of Imaginations at the School of Environment and Architecture. Since morning, we have had very engaging conversations which dealt with provocations about ways of engaging with urban complexities, the many sensorial and sensory measures of form and space, infrastructures and learning environments, the rethinking of big data through cracks that emerge in it as errors and glitches into algorithmic intelligence. The panel of speakers we have with us today have had a long durée practice that is embedded in the question of space, thought through deep entanglements of relationships, spatial continuums, temporalities, claims, the spatialization of memory. We take this opportunity to introduce them to everyone, starting with Sara M. Anwar. Sara M. Anwar is an architect, researcher, and design communication strategist. Her passion lies in building mentorship within architecture, supporting women in the discipline, and facilitating networks of research, communication, and knowledge exchange. Cornell Architecture alum, Anwar is a founder and director of Architectum, a Dubai-based platform promoting research and dialogue in architecture in the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa. Dissecting organic informal networks within urban environments has been a focus of her research-based projects. She recently presented mapping festivities as curator of the National Pavilion of Pakistan at the Venice Architecture Biennale 2021. Before mapping festivities, Sara presented Anatomy of Informality at the Egypt Pavilion at Biennale Architectura 2018 in Venice. Mapping festivity is a continuation of this journey of exploring intersecting narratives to reveal an authentic condition, a condition that maps the social, the cultural, the urban journey of post-partition and post-colonial Pakistan. It is an exercise in archiving and restitching human narratives from diverse yet seamlessly coexisting pulsating conditions, revealing invisible egalitarian spaces and systems of survival within the city. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
The next on panel with us is Thamotharampillai Shanaathanan. Shanaathanan is a visual artist who lives and works in Jaffna, Sri Lanka. He's a founder of Sri Lankan Archive for Contemporary Art, Architecture and Design. His work has been exhibited widely in Sri Lanka and at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC in Vancouver, Queensland Art Gallery in South Brisbane, Museum of Ethnology in Vienna, and Devi Art Foundation in New Delhi, amongst others. His book publications include the one-year drawing project, The Incomplete Tombu, and A to Z of Conflict, which is a forthcoming book. He holds a degree in painting from the University of Delhi and a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's currently a senior lecturer in art history in the Department of Fine Arts at Jaffna University and an advisor on Sri Lanka's national curriculum for teaching in the school, teaching art in the schools. Welcome, Shanaathanan. The next on panel with us is Ahmed Rasel. He's a visual storyteller. He has a master's degree in Bengali literature and a diploma in photography from Counter Photo, a Center for Visual Arts, where he now works as an adjunct faculty member. Rasel's work presents contemporary socio-political issues intertwined with his personal experiences in which memory, collective memory, space, politics, psychological states, environment, water bodies are some of the crucial motifs. His work has been published and exhibited in several national and international forums, in photo festivals and biennales. He was one of the finalists of Samadhani Art Award 2018, a participant of the Young Subcontinent Project of Serendipity Art Festival in 2017, and one of the finalists of Stitching Screens Grant by Foundation of Indian Contemporary Art and Samadhani Art Foundation 2020. Welcome, Ahmed. They will be in conversation with Rupali and myself from the School of Environment and Architecture. I'll quickly do a round of introductions for both of us. Rupali Gupte is an architect and urbanist based in Mumbai. She's a co-founder and professor at the School of Environment and Architecture and a partner at Bard Studio. She has recently been a senior research fellow at the University of Brighton. Her work involves research on contemporary South Asian architecture and urbanism with a focus on housing and urban form, tactical spatial practices, and the role of gender in shaping habitation. Her work often crosses disciplinary boundaries and takes different forms: writings, drawings, mixed media works, installations, curations, conversations, walks, and spatial interventions. Her work has been shown at the 56th Venice Art Biennale, 10th Sao Paulo Biennale, Seoul Biennale, Magba, Barcelona, Matt Museum, Lisbon, Devi Art Foundation, Delhi, Mumbai Art Room, Project 88 and Mumbai, amongst others. I'm Dipti Bhaindarkar, an architect and urban designer. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture since its inception. My practice engages with the question on institutional thinking to make academic administration agile. My research work focuses on experiential dimension of technology, on explorations in sustainable development and practices, and on South Asian architecture and urbanism. With this round of introduction, I will now invite Rupali to set up the questions for the symposium and present our provocations. Rupali.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Dipti. I'm just going to share my screen. Share. Yeah. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, as we've also sent all of you the coordinates of this symposium and this particular panel have been set up around what spatial thinking means from South Asia, and that's particularly important for us because what we want to kind of think of what does it mean to think from South Asia as opposed to of South Asia, because that's really how a lot of academic thinking, a lot of work has been framed, where South Asia has become the field. But what does it mean to think from South Asia becomes an important question for us. And to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, what we've seen is that the thinking of rather than the thinking from, the thinking of has been entrenched in this obsession of questions of identity. And particularly I'm giving the example of architecture in India, but I know that this has been the case with all of South Asia, that we have somehow contained ourselves in a kind of nationalistic frame of thinking of what does it mean to think of a question of identity from a particular country. But what we also then see, if we kind of expand that frame, we understand that there is a kind of regional exchange through which we can think of space. And so for us, the thinking from the region becomes interesting, and particularly because in most of our cases post-independence, there was this kind of obsession with what is the identity of a nation. And a lot of that identity came from actually a stylistic reading of architecture. And that really came from the way a lot of colonial documentation was happening of architecture in South Asia. And I just want to show you what a pre-colonial, for example, reading of space was. And this is a particular example of Jaipur. And if you see the image in the center is the image of the Manoharpur Palace. And really, I mean, this is something when we were doing an exhibition on, thinking of space, particularly in India, we were saying, how were some of the buildings in Jaipur built? What were some of the drawings through which they were built? And we didn't find any of those drawings. And then when we saw, we found these kind of drawings that are there in the center, which in a kind of colonial imagination would have been seen as rudimentary drawings, So, and you see that these are these kind of strange plan, section, elevation mixed together. There's series of notations. Some of them were poetry. Some of them were mundane sort of marks that spoke about, how much material would be used in certain places, what certain kind of, there were notes to artisans. And this was actually something that produced some of the most sophisticated spaces in South Asia. And so then we were saying, what does it mean then to think of, and this is really what happens post. This is the late 1800s. You see Swinton Jacob making a portfolio, which is called the Jaipur portfolio. And that is for the first time, these buildings that were drawn then in that previous process that, that you saw were now drawn in this particular way, in ways that were consolidated through orthography. They were consolidated as objects, as tiles. And so you could actually remove, they were broken down into columns and series of elements that were then seen as tiles, which could then come back and be replicated as pastiche. So you could have a plan that came from another context, a modern plan, a European plan, and then you would have these kind of elements that were like pastiche stuck onto buildings. And so there was a kind of stylistic reading that came up with this, and that obsession of really understanding what is architecture, Indian architecture, or I guess Pakistani architecture or Sri Lankan architecture really comes from this sort of stylistic reading in some ways. And then the second quadrant, and this is actually quite interesting because this is how the stylistic reading also kind of goes into pedagogy, because if you see some of these frames here, this is Swinton Jacobs' drawings, which are being mimicked and copied by some of the students of the JJ College of Architecture, the first architecture colleges that are set up by the colonial administration. And these are then the people who then become the principals of the school later. So, I mean, that's one of the coordinates, that in some ways there is this kind of obsession with identity and this question of spatial thinking that is embedded in the stylistic thinking. And then the second coordinate is a kind of belated modernity, that there is this kind of idea that South Asia is in some ways is catching up. And there's also the recent exhibition that is at MoMA, celebrating this kind of architecture, South Asian architecture. But what often we kind of miss out is that this is a certain kind of modernity that premises itself on questions of permanence, completeness, perfection, clarity, a sense of property, a sense of the building as an object at one time, as opposed to some of the other logics through which space in South Asia were built, that were built around questions of impermanence, incompleteness, imperfection, series of contradictions, incoherence, multiplicity, and perhaps also a kind of incrementality, where there are several agents that were there who were actors in the production of space rather than that one singular architect. And so what the modern project in its kind of universality and utopianism misses out is the multiple dimensions of spatial ecologies, that kind of also fails to see the embedded logics that are produced through these multiplicities that have in them a kind of coordinates of spatial justice. And I'll kind of talk about how those, a little bit kind of delve on how spatial justice is something that is integral to a kind of understanding and an understanding of space in South Asia, which gets in some ways curtailed, or in some ways also sort of congealed through kind of the modern logics. So that's something that that's the exhibition, and so our kind of provocation, and which is why we're also interested in all of your works, is that then I think it's important to kind of shift our thinking from the idea of the modern project to starting to think of space and spatial justice that is embedded in a kind of social, political, environmental, and material ecological logic. And that's where a lot of your works also come in. So very quick, the ways that we've been sort of grappling with is how do we look at new conceptual frameworks for thinking from South Asia, and how do we think of the production of space differently from here? And I just present three preliminary sort of conceptual frames through which we have been thinking of architecture from South Asia being kind of reimagined. And this is, I'll give certain examples which are coming from our own archives of studies from Nepal, from Bangladesh, which are currently on. But these sort of, in some ways, what we're sort of proposing is that they start applying to series of spatial logics in South Asia. So I'll just go through very quickly a couple of examples for each of these: an architecture of fuzzy boundaries, architecture of claims, and the architecture of incrementality. These are three conceptual frames that we are proposing. So if you look at just the kind of idea of fuzzy boundaries, and this is the Hanuman, Dhoka, Dharbar Square in Nepal. And again, if we kind of look at the colonial archive, these have been seen through a kind of stylistic frame. These have been seen through the kind of idea of the object. But if you look at, the fabric of this place, you start seeing that this is made. There's the kind of fuzzy logic of the way the settlement comes together through frames. So one is that it's very important in the way it kind of embeds itself in a social logic of how trade happens. The palace is otherwise seen as this kind of you have a series of works from historians, colonial historians, who talk about the palace as a kind of objectified space. But the palace really was never just that one kind of space of governance. It was a space that sort of embedded logics of how trade sort of mixed with governance, with negotiations. This is the left-hand drawing, shows that it's located on a very important trade route, and the place where most sort of movement happens. And then if we go further, you also see that this is not something that is in some ways made at one go. You start seeing that these are a series of incremental ways in which the fabric comes together, and there is a kind of fuzzy boundary of the public and the private through which it kind of operates. But in kind of pedagogic logics, we never see them as these kind of embedded social logics. We always see them as an object to be studied stylistically. Or for example, if you look at the house, like this is the Tharo house in Nepal, again, there's a kind of blurred boundary between what is living space, what is a kind of workspace, the space of the human, the space of the animal, all sort of starts getting blurry and starts getting mixed up. And that's something that we are contending, that it's the modern logic that started creating, sort of consolidating boundaries between the inside and the outside, between human and non-human, and also created very almost sort of segregated logics in which, for example, the kitchen space gets separated from the bedroom space, the way various kind of gender roles get segregated, starts congealing in the kind of modern logic. Or this is Manikganj in Bangladesh, again, this kind of fuzzy boundary between land and water. So you start seeing this kind of dig, elevate, dwell kind of settlement, where you see the kind of porous boundary between land and water and how it gets negotiated. So the home is really not the object of that kind of small, the space that is inside, but it's all of these spaces outside, right? Like it's the cowshed, the ditch, the tube well, the toilet, the kitchen space outside, all of this becomes the home. So it's a kind of ecological logic of the home rather than a kind of modern sort of consolidated propertied idea of the home through which we understand space. Or even the slum in Corel, sort of, which starts negotiating the kind of the space between land and water through its kind of embedded logics. But then, as opposed to that, the modern home really completely comes back and consolidates the boundaries between what is public, private, what is inside, outside, what is land, water, what the human and the non-human sort of start getting completely in some ways compartmentalized. So So the second one is what we are proposing is the architecture of claims is something through which we can understand space in South Asia. Again, something that we haven't seen before. And this is again a case of Bhaktapur in Nepal. And what is interesting is that you see the same land being used by the wheat farmer who kind of provides his land to the brick maker for setting up his brick kiln in return for wheat in the off season. One piece of the land is then claimed by two sets of people. There are many such examples of this kind of complex occupation of land, complex tenure, and we see that all across South Asia. I mean, this is the case of Nepal. You see in West Bengal, you'll find the farmer and the fisher folk actually use the same land in different seasons. So there's a kind of, again, what the modern logics, what we are proposing have in some ways congealed the kind of propertied idea of space, where you have one kind of a polygon that is drawn and the GIS logic then starts kicking off, where you have a kind of polygon which says this is the only place that there's only one owner, whereas historically we've seen that the same space has been claimed by multiple kinds of people. So what does it mean to think of space through the idea of claims rather than to think of it through the idea of ownership? And so this is another case of the Patti house in houses in Nepal. These are small, almost these kind of living room spaces that are outside in settlements, which then get used by series of people from the community, and you see that that's the development that has actually led to the Kashta Mandapa, which is the space for the trader, for the kind of movement of traders to kind of house themselves temporarily. So the idea of claims, I think, becomes important, and this is the river gypsy community in Bangladesh, and how in some ways they've started sort of claiming land between land and water in this kind of incremental way. But I'll just come to the third frame, which is the architecture of incrementality. And again, that is, I mean, almost sort of 90% of space in South Asia is built through incremental logic, something that is almost impossible to think through modern frameworks. And so, for example, again, the Kashta Mandapa, if you see that, it was always built. Recently, it got demolished with the earthquake. But the way it was built was always built through this kind of incremental logic. And this is again something you'd see all over South Asia. That in some ways, the construction is such that you would keep replacing. So there's something is never permanent. You keep replacing. There's a kind of repair, retrofit logic that operates through where you kind of keep working, extending the kind of life of a space through repair, retrofit, and through an incremental logic. And then also the whole sort of communitarian aspect of who are the agents who are involved in this process. And you'll see that it's not one single architect, but there's a kind of plethora of agents who are involved in the process of this kind of reconstruction. And this is something that we've also seen in the case of the reconstruction of the Kashta Mandapa. And this one is actually the final case that I'll present, which is the architecture of the houses from Munshiganj in Bangladesh. Again, these houses come up only 100 years ago, also kind of negotiating the climate, the landscape of climate change. And again, these houses are built in almost this kind of modular logic, where there's a whole ecology of craftspeople who are building this house, a house that is almost like a backpack that can be carried away to safer locations, and built through this kind of process of it's almost sort of modularly bringing this together. There are, in terms of crisis, people also sell parts of the house, and then also kind of buy other parts of the house to then kind of expand a house, or the house also reduces in some ways. But there's a whole sort of ecology that is in place that actually produces this kind of space, and as opposed to the idea of the singular architect. So yeah, I'll end there, and that's a frame that we've been sort of working with. The three frame, the idea of fuzzy boundaries, the idea of claims, and the idea of incrementality. These are three frameworks through which that we are proposing we are hoping that this kind of research on space in South Asia expands to in some ways include many more conceptual frames through which we can think of space in South Asia. And that's again why we've also invited all of you, because many of your works also in some ways engage with many other coordinates of spatial thinking in South Asia. So that's so yeah, with that I'll invite Sara to present her exposition.
Thank you, Rupali. So I'm actually just going to go through a little presentation that I've put together that just kind of outlines things that Architectum has been involved in. And almost instead of going into details of what we produced, just touching on the thought process, the intentions, and sort of the issues that interest us. Now, I'm going to try something. I'm going to try sharing a keynote and see. Let's see if it. I've never actually played a keynote through Zoom, so I'm going to see how that works. Okay. So Architectum is a research platform, a network for knowledge exchange and mentorship in architecture, occupying the fertile domain of the process as an incubator for observation, inspiration, and collaboration. We are involved in observing the built and unbuilt environment, exploring, archiving, and disseminating in the form of research and exploration that can then identify, reveal hidden, powerful, pulsating conditions and systems of resistance and survival, often embedded in seemingly chaotic and haphazard or non-visible systems. Invested in the language of architecture and the archaeology of contemporary urban conditions, the research focuses on dissecting the spatial, formal, social, and cultural implications of occupation, boundaries, movement, and exchange across time, space, memory, and landscape. Only through a rigor of investigation and reimagining can the accepted be revisited. Only through this methodological liberating of the mind can an architect redefine, repurpose, recalibrate, and reinvent. Observing is a way for the architect to absorb and expand her visual and emotional memory, adding to a toolkit of ideas for her architectural imagination. One of our avenues of operations are a series of dialogues and workshops that we do, student-based workshops. In Dubai, Mapping Productions was a week-long program organized at Al Sarkal Avenue. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's a cultural hub set within an industrial neighborhood. Here we study the context of alcoves as a site for material architecture and cultural production. We looked at alcoves as a neighborhood where the streets are identical looking, with dusty clusters of warehouses that are mostly indistinguishable and sometimes seem abandoned, in contrast to the polished interior pockets where cultural events and activities take place. Alcoves is a microcosm of interesting conditions. Streets are built for cars and not for pedestrians. The smart city enables you to pay for parking through your cell phone through an app, but systems of physical infrastructure remain chaotic. Participants use the instrument of collage to create narratives referencing layers of alcoves where, devoid of human presence, hanging clothing, and a pedestrian sign reference an uncanny presence of foreign laborers who, even though are present, somehow remain unnoticed and invisible. Artwork from the galleries in Al Sarkal Avenue are placed on the blank, forgotten facade of an old warehouse, forcing a symbiotic relationship between the art world and the industrial context, questioning whether art can become a tool to communicate between the demographics of this industrial community. Warehouses are punctured and opened, converting interior corridors to public passageway, investigating possibilities of opening public pockets and access within otherwise insulated conditions. Untamed Ecologies is an ongoing project where we look at outcroppings in empty plots in Dubai that survive extreme climate conditions without being externally supported. The study of these site natives is an effort of observing and cataloging evidence that allows systems of survival in landscape. These gardens are sometimes haphazard organizations and at other precisely curated. At organized moments, the relationship between infrastructure and landscape becomes the focus. These gardens don't scream and shout for attention like architecture of the city. In fact, they survive by being modest, not shouting for attention, by almost disappearing into the context. In the absence of armatures supporting survival and growth, Untamed Gardens of Dubai are testaments to resistance, perseverance, and survival. These plants, gardens, and trees are passive witnesses and active participants in the urban landscape. Perhaps it would be less political to call these acts of rebellion sustainable systems. Progressive participations in exhibitions has given a larger canvas to the research and dissemination. Anatomy of Informality formed our submission for the Egypt Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. From our initial conversations with the curators, we were interested in observing the chaos of Cairo as a pulsating body, functioning through the support of a network of informal systems. Roba Becchia, the age-old vendor-driven recycling system in Cairo, provided the perfect lens to scan the city for similar acts of resilience, surfacing in critical situations, much like the body's own self-defense mechanism. These informal systems activate free space and allude to a certain freedom of creating and owning space. We looked at the informal antique markets and vendors that create fluid movement, stitching the spaces of the city. Roba Becchia is simultaneously noun and verb. It is the assertion of ownership and a freedom to act. A network of informally erected markets embedded within the pockets of leftover spaces and infrastructures. Here, the seemingly haphazard arrangements of goods follows both an inherent logic and a unique system of unwritten yet clearly understood rules that both define and facilitate the event. Our anatomy investigates informality across 3 dimensions: the object at a micro scale, the individual at a human scale, and the city at an infrastructural scale. We begin by both conceptually and literally dissecting the city, surgically extracting from its photographs a series of everyday objects, actions, and landscapes. These urban fragments are then reassembled into informal and unexpected conditions. A subsequent translation into line drawings of the collapsed textures and grains, of densities and orientations facilitates a layering of textures and scales where the combination collapsing of multiple traces explores the complexity of informal systems and suggests an alternative mapping of objects and events that supports the functioning of a city as an organized chaos. Mapping festivities made our submission for the 2020 Venice Architecture Biennale, where I acted as curator. Here we explored the many dimensions of weddings in Pakistan as festive events that are both a saturated expression of our cultural traditions and institutions driving impact at a social and urban scale. The first task, obviously, was to bring together a team of exceptional minds and formulate research partnerships with architecture students and urban research labs in universities in Karachi. Students were involved with an ambition to engage, empower, and elevate. So this has been a part of Architectum's mission from the beginning, is to focus on observation as a very significant act of pre-production and obviously analysis, but activating these networks as a form of making more permanent change. Mapping festivities investigates weddings as events that create a spatial network, bringing together individuals to industries from diverse contexts and across all classes of society. Acting literally as connective urban and territorial tissue, these festivities are in fact systems that allow us to live together. Mapping festivities studies the explicit typology of the wedding venue as a site for cultural production. The Shadi Hall first appeared in the early 1980s to address the needs of the fast-growing immigrant population of Karachi. Residential villas were transformed into designated spaces for weddings through interventions, such as the addition of billboard-inspired entrance facades. This facade physically and metaphorically created a permeable boundary between the space of the city and a new space for performance. The Shadi Hall emerged as a direct response to the social and urban needs for a specific space to serve the wedding performance. A unique architectural typology born out of the developing needs, wedding knits together a multiplicity of cultural and economic interplays that are performed in high energy theaters of celebration. We investigated weddings as events that create a spatial network, bringing together individuals and industries, both at a macro and micro level, from diverse contexts and across all classes of society. Perhaps the only egalitarian space left in the city, wedding venues open up a space for people from different industries and social classes to coexist and create harmony, where a poolwala is as essential to the production as a high-end bridal dress designer. Our project particularly reveals the complex community that built this underlying infrastructure: the architects, construction workers, designers, caterers, photographers, technicians, makeup artists, videographers, and performers. These people are ordinary citizens that become purveyors of festive dreams. So I'm just going to play a loop of the strip of wedding halls that exists in a neighborhood in Karachi. And essentially what they were was started with a couple of houses that, just by the default of being on a very visible avenue, gained commercial value and were transformed into spaces of wedding by the mere intervention of placing almost cinematic devices of these facades, like billboard-inspired facades. And for the longest time, these spaces have been considered either problematic. They're clearly very informally designed and articulated. The whole intention of mapping festivity, and the reason why I listed the previous investigations too, the whole idea is to really look at these seemingly either chaotic or problematic conditions that either shout out as problematic or remain hidden and invisible, but somewhere in their informal growth and birth lies a strong system of resilience, almost like a body self-defense mechanism that we feel is very important to study, learn from, and support. Weddings alone, considered very problematic as an industry in Pakistan, most of South Asia, I believe, activates so many micro industries. Every middle-class neighborhood has a beauty salon that is run by mostly housewives who are trying to either earn a second living or, it activates a secondary economy that is directly going to, support people. And largely, this whole infrastructure that even this one day of wedding activates is happening, round the clock every day, and it lies as a very invisible system within the city and goes unnoticed. Similarly, in Cairo, with the anatomy of informality, the informal housing, being considered an informal and chaotic system, is actually more well-designed than most planned developments, because it comes from people's hard-earned money, and they're the ones supervising those constructions. And at the end of the day, these micro acts of resilience create change at an infrastructure level for the city. So with a lot of informal settlements in Cairo, what ended up happening was they were planned in areas where there was no water supply, no electricity supply. And just by the act of their presence, the government was forced to develop those areas and supply them with these infrastructures. So I guess I'll just leave these sort of thoughts out there. And
yeah, thanks, Sara. That was very interesting. The idea of the anatomy of informality, and also this idea of what does it mean? I think the term roba becchia, right? Is that I'm pronouncing it right? Yeah, I think that's fantastic, because I mean we are calling it claims, and in some ways it also kind of intersects with that logic of what does it mean to kind of claim space. So I think it's fantastic as a concept.
Right, because you know that it comes from the Italian term roba vecchia, and I mean there's so many levels and layers of authentic conditions that are sort of revealed that I can't even capture in a presentation, in a single presentation. For instance, even as a pneumatic device, the chance of the vendors within the city, create this almost egalitarian space for them to function in spaces where they're not allowed to visit. So in terms of financial economies, in terms of claiming space and ownership.
Yeah. Thanks. With that, I think we'll invite Rasel to present his photographs and his exposition.
Thank you, Rupali. Can you see my screen?
But we're not seeing anything on it. It says Ahmed Rasel has started screen sharing, but we are not seeing the. Okay, now we're seeing a slideshow.
Yeah.
But we're not seeing photographs.
Thank you, Rupali. So before,
we're seeing notes.
Before presenting.
We're seeing notes. That's what you want to show. That's is that the right slideshow?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So before presenting my work, I would like to share some remarks on a few urban master plan of Dhaka city, from British rule to current Bangladesh. So here, the first master plan we had in 1917. The plan was done by Mr. Patrick Geddes. So I would like to start from there. The great change came in the 1880s with the railway, which was done along what at the time were the outskirts of Dhaka. In this way, the city turned its face towards land, and the river and canals began to lose their economic importance and social status. And yet it might well be assumed that much of the wetland disappeared during the construction of the late British Dhaka, the expansion of Dhaka away from the river Buriganga. In the early 20th century began the first environmentally insensitive development of the city. Patrick Geddes' emphasis on the smaller water space was canal were left unheeded. With this, the opportunity was missed to integrate the built environmental of modern Dhaka with the small water spaces, which would be preserved and used and would work as an integral part of the drainage and urban life. Within 5 years of the establishment of Pakistan, the Town Development Improvement Act 1957 was passed. Under the Act, Dhaka Improvement Trust was formed in 1956 with the objective of improving urban condition of the city. But the body of politic of Pakistan, neither democracy nor ecology were fully put into practice. If the British recreated some forest landscape in the East Pakistan period, some water space were created around Sher-Bangla Nagar. Without the river being placed within the everyday life of city, the water space lost their popular attachment and the government maintenance. The exclusion of the river from the city spaces effect posed a smaller water space inside the city into further negligence. The attitude towards the city canals was informed by industrial and transport needed, not environmentally consideration, bringing with its implication for free-flowing water space. The capitalist intervention by the garment industry since 1980s made the urban built environment chaos worse. Without a comprehensive plan in place, the development of the river from the city space in effect with the smaller water inside the sorry, I'm repeating. The capitalist intervention by the garments industry since the 1980s made the urban built environment south worse. But without a comprehensive plan in place, the development of the city was associated with mostly haphazard housing projects and industrial unit, which still occupy Dhaka's vital landscape, increasing the demand on water, energy, and transport of the city. The national quest for the earning of foreign exchange through exports led to the establishment of a score of garment industry, undermost of which emerged inside the city. Some of the factories were established on the field of canals, somewhere on the bank of the canal and river, leading to their serious pollution and encroachment. Other industrial establishment follows suit in the same fashion. This development at the expense of Dhaka environment were expedited by the filling up of canals, rivers, and wetland for housing development by private companies. How environmental consideration could be situated in the development planning of the megacity of Dhaka remains an unresolved issue. So these are the reference report on the master plan for Dhaka 1960s. And the second one is Mr. Patrick Kedder's 1917 report on town planning Dhaka, and the first master plan for Dhaka and environmental exploration Iftikhar Iqbal. And the last slide is the recent report of TIB, which is Transparency International Bangladesh, informed that around 1,000 ponds which were in the city have now been totally destroyed. TIB recently trying to recover 13 out of 52 canals, but could not succeed so far. 800 acres of land in 5 rivers, including Buriganga and Shitalanka, were illegally grafted, violating the Wetland Act of 2000. The contemporary planning study shows that 40% of the wetland of Dhaka city have disappeared in 20 years due to the indiscriminate filling up of lowland and flow zone both by the public and private agencies. Damage of this water channel and depression have resulting in the interruption and alteration of the natural process of landscape, land acceleration, land information, and ecosystem. Waterlogging, pollution, building collapse, and bad human health condition are the sum of the several consequences of the environment change. So now I would like to share my first project here.
Is it visible?
Yeah. So memories of water, the story of the relationship of people with the water bodies of Dhaka city. So as I shared with my previous slide, that most of the water bodies of Dhaka are destroying by intervention of urban development by the government agency and private agencies. So I'm here kind of doing a project to memorize the thing that the past relationship with water body and the human being of Dhaka city or the citizens of Dhaka city. So it's a large work as we don't have that much time. So I would like to share part of it. So this is the first photograph. This is a place called Tafalia in northern part of extended Dhaka city. There is a years back. This place was the wetland. Now it's a government project is coming. Can you go the next slide? And this is also the two boats. Boats is just the left unused in the riverbank of Balu River because the boat is not need anymore. The whole place is under gone under a construction site of private housing projects. Next image, please. And this is a artifact of the cultural festival of Pohela Boishakh Dhaka. Is a kind of irony because the river is gone and we are celebrating the colorful fish here in Dhaka city. And this is a photograph of in the bank of Tura River. The river now become the just most of the part of the river is illegally grabbed by the local powerful people or housing society people. So it's now become it's kind of the grassland. Most of the river parts. So next slide. And this is also the internally migrant worker. They are washing their hands after their work. This is also the part of the housing project. And this photograph is a man is having his bath in a community bathing place in Old Dhaka. Next image. And this is again this is again a housing project in northern part of Dhaka, a brick field in the bank of Buriganga River. And this is a part of housing project of a huge housing project of in eastern part of Dhaka city. And there is a worship structure of the Durga Puja. And this is a part of Hatir Jil, if one of the few water bodies still in Dhaka city. And we are seeing a building called the BGME building. Is illegal. They built it illegally inside the lake, but the good news is they are demolishing it by the order of Supreme Court. And this is a this is a tiny water body at part of an art institution in Dhaka city. Next, please. And this is also the large housing project in eastern part of Dhaka city, and two young friends having their time in the bank of a pond. Next one, please. And this photograph is part of the university campus called Dhaka University, and Jagannath Hall student dormitory. There is a pond, and they use this pond as a, there is a temple in the bank of the beside the ponds. So every year they use this pond for during the Durga Puja. They establish kind of a statue from the statue every year. Next slide, please. And this is a part of the Sara. This place is a historically very important place of Bangladesh, and they have a artificial water body here. So the irony is that most of the water bodies of Dhaka city is lost, and the river is destroying by without the maintenance of government. But still, we are having a little bit of water bodies, artificial water bodies within the historical Sara. Next one, please. And this is the this is the place called Third Project in the northern part of Dhaka city. In the background, the metro rail project is going on. The family, the man is fishing here, but the whole area is now under the project. The man is still enjoying his afternoon fishing with his tiny boats. Next one, please. And this is the bank of Buriganga River. And though sometimes the Dhaka city corruption is trying to demolishing the illegal establishment in the bank of Turag River. Next one, please. And this is also part of the Buriganga River. The brick owners is grabbing the river bed of Buriganga River, and then they establish a couple of brick field inside the river bed. Next one, please. And this is a ghat of or landing station of Buriganga River. So historically, Ghat is a community place for Bangladeshi people. They meet often without any plan or without any plan. They just hang out on the Ghat. It's a common thing in Bangladesh. And this is a school at Dhaka city. The place called Demra. The whole field of the school is underwater because of the water logging. Next one. And this is again this is again the part of a housing project of Bangladesh government. Few years ago, the whole place was underwater. Now they are having a very big housing projects. Next one, please. And this is Buriganga River, top view of Buriganga River from a rooftop of a huge building. Next one, please. And this is again, this place is called the third project, a government project. The whole area is now full of green grass. Is a kind of irony because the place is, in a few years, this whole place will be a huge housing project. Next one, please. And this is water logging happening in Dhaka city during the rainy season. Next one, please. And this is this photograph is a from a upcoming housing project. So this is kind of a symbolic photograph because everything is collapsing, and building and collapsing is a both way. So that's it. Can you go to the next project? It's called Nocturne, the fourth one.
Rasel, so we have actually another 20 minutes. Maybe what we can do is, I mean, these are wonderful, really interesting to kind of see this idea of your very powerful photographs, the water stories, and the way you've sort of laid out for us the whole sort of the political and economic sort of frameworks through which on which these changes are based. And what we're also seeing is that it's the modern project, right, which is creating these very ironic sort of positions of one, removing yourself from the life and living that is embedded in the idea of a swampy terrain of life, which is with water. And so on the one hand, you drain life of water, and with that kind of comes in all kinds of environmental problems. And so what does it mean to really kind of think of space not through these boundaries, but through, and you presented Patrick Giddis's idea of really kind of working with more conservative surgery logics of thinking of space through. So if I can propose, if we can go to Shanaathanan and then come back maybe in
sure,
some of the other projects, that would be nice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Shanaathanan? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, just to kind of save, because we are running out of time. So if we can bring this discussion back, that will be nice.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Can you share? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides, but maybe you can go to the slideshow mode, or okay. This is good. Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
So thank you so much, Rupali and the team for inviting me for this event. And as you all know, I'm not an architect, but teaching architecture as part of the art history, and also because of that, started involving in the local architecture documentation. That's how I did one project on architecture. Actually, this project I'm going to talk about is my book on architecture of memory, which published in 2011. And so what I'm trying to show is the background of the whole story of the bookmaking, and then the methodology or methods of handling these stories. As you all know, like there is an ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, and there was a civil war happening till 2009, and that was cruelly entered in a kind of a government initiative. So it started with so it's like I think this whole project actually fit into this your theme, how in regarding the political and the social environment in a way, and also the psychological being of an individual or a community in a kind of a space. Yes, so there was a kind of a fight in between the government and the LTTE in last more than 30 years, and to carve out a kind of a Tamil nation, and so a kind of a political space. And So this political space making on like but the tragedy behind this whole thing is like, but that ended up in a kind of a very cruel war, and that made people to be displaced. And so they were thinking about carving out a nation space, but even they started losing their home spaces. So that's what this project is actually talking about. So in last 30 years of civil war, like more than 3 lakhs of innocent people died, and thousands of people disappeared and missing, and still people are mothers and women are like waiting for their sons and husbands and fathers to return. So this is an image of the cinema theater. You can see the bullets and how this whole architectural space, the body of the architecture is wounded. So you can imagine about the community living around or living with this kind of ruined buildings. So there is no family in the north and eastern part, which is dominated by the Tamil and Muslim population, without a kind of without the experience of displacement or affected by the war. Yeah, in 2009, the war came to an end by the government most cruel military initiative by killing more than 40,000 innocents and displacing around 5 lakhs people. So I just wanted to talk about just to touch upon 2 of my earlier projects to contextualize my later project. So I did a project in 2004 in the public library, which was burned by the government in 1981. This is supposed to be the Asia's one of the #1 libraries, or South Asia's. So then it was whitewashed and recreated or renovated. So during that time, we had a show, and it's called History of Histories, in which I collected 4 of my students actually worked with the community, and we collected around 500 objects from the war zone. And at that time, the war had a kind of a 25 years of life, and so these people were talking about their experience in 25 years of, in living in a 25 years of war zone. So they gave us different kinds of objects, and so this through the object we started. So the kind of memory object, and we started building a museum, or that we transfer the entire empty library, book racks into a kind of a museum space. Then in 2009, I got an invitation to do a kind of similar kind of project in Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, in which I started talking about this whole question of home or imagining or imagination of home or image of home. I asked people to give me present me an object that symbolize or memorize their experience of home, both in their homeland or in a kind of diasporic situation. So this was the exhibition in Vancouver, kind of similar kind of practice, but I also brought a kind of a notion of travel and other kinds of like homemaking in Vancouver and all kinds of things. So this actually, after seeing this project, we ended up this third project called the Incomplete Tombu, in which, so it's an artist book project published in 2012, presented in a form of a bureaucratic document. Files contain 80 documents of civilians displaced from the north part of island during the civil conflict between 1983 and 2009, presently living either in Sri Lanka or abroad. This project records the stories that remove Sri Lankans from their homes and the memories that they took with them. So this is the book. So it's looked like a kind of a government official file. So what is Tombu then? The Vislu Tamil dictionary defined Tombu, a public register of land. The word Tombu is a common word in among Sinhala and Tamil speaking communities in Sri Lanka. It's derived from the Greek word tom, meaning a section, most likely a papyrus, which gave rise to the Latin word tom, a large book. Later, Portuguese and Dutch used this term for the earlier forms of land register or deeds in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka was under the rule of Portuguese and Dutch, and then the English. So this was actually a kind of a word for land register. So this actually, if you look at the Tombu document, it's talk about land in relationship to your neighbors. So who so and so is having boundaries or sharing boundaries with these people. So that kind of information is given, which I found very interesting, because it's like so a person is actually defined according to others, or it's a connected history, which I found very interesting. So then actually I played around this thing. So also in the 30 years of war, there were documents about there are documents created for compensation and other kinds of things, in which they talk about material loss, but they don't talk about a kind of a psychological loss or a kind of a rootlessness created by the war. So this project actually looking at that psychological level, or a kind of a feeling in the terrain of free feeling. So the colonial documents talk about the ownership of the land in relation to psychological boundaries of the plot, and the book project tried to map out the emotional boundaries of the property immediately after the end of the armed conflict. So, so when I started working with this, when I was imagining about this project, my problem was this, like how to present the individuals who is not a visual artist while incorporating my skills in visual representation. Because in the earlier project, I acted as a kind of a curator. Here, I wanted to bring my ability to draw or something. And at the same time, there is also a problem. I don't want to speak for them, because all of them are having some or the other story to tell. And similarly, I am also having so many stories of displacement. So how to bring these two elements together rather than just representing them, how to speak with them. So that was a kind of an idea. So how to transform the form of ordinary book into a kind of an extraordinary art object. For this purpose, I have chosen method of collecting and testimonies through the process of memorizing involved with the act of drawing. So what I did was I asked people to draw their ground plan of the house. I randomly chosen people, because I told you, because there's no one without the kind of an experience of displacement, or there's no house without the touch of the war. So you can ask anyone. So I randomly chosen people, but it's a kind of rhizomic process. So people introduce me others. So that's how I just cross my social and caste or class boundaries. Then I was thinking about how to involve them in terms of the project, and how to bring their drawing into it. Then there were incidents in which I observed before the project that people have a kind of a tendency to draw their ground plan. Like, even if you don't have a drawing skill, you know how to draw or how to explain someone about your structure of the house. And during the war, during the displacement, people, when they started moving and when they started occupying or getting a new space in some other places, or started living with strangers, they had a kind of a tendency to explain where we were from and what kind of life we had and all kinds of things, in which they have to they draw their drawn their house plans, maybe on the floor, or a kind of soil or something like that. Since this I noticed, number one. Second thing, when in 2004, when I went to London, I visited my wife's friend's house. This structure was in their drawing room. During that time, it was a kind of very boring experience to me, but later on I realized it's something very, very interesting. The story is that this girl actually got married in Colombo, and that time there was no passage to Jaffna. So, and the husband came from London, a Sri Lankan living in London, who came and got married. This house they gave as a family house, they gave as a dowry to this girl. but the girl they can't come, and the man can't come and see the house. So that this girl actually explained the whole house in verbal terms, or must have drawn the ground plan or something, and he had rebuilt this with a cardboard, and this was in the center of the sitting room, and whoever coming, they were actually showing. So he also exactly made those furniture and all these things according to her memory. So this memory house became a kind of a object of homemaking in London, which I found later on I realized so important to look at, and how these diasporic community actually living with this kind of a memory, and even though in a displaced land, refugees having this kind of homecoming or returning, or a kind of a nostalgia about home, and how this is a kind of an iconic representation of that. So then these two actually made me to think, okay, these people can draw something. So they have drawn. So I randomly asked them to draw their I asked them to draw their ground plans. Then so they started explaining what has happened to their house, or what they related the family or the social or the village history related with the building. So yeah, so this was a kind of process. So but when you look at the storytelling of the displacement, this was not the first incident they were telling the story. They told these stories to different people for different purposes. Like government went there for compensation, NGOs went there for other purposes, human rights organization. So they also stitch their stories according to their need. So this memory always alter. It's also always present in the. It's always depending on the presence. So it's like in my project, it's like I'm not going to give a kind of compensation or something. So this, and also the method I used was ask them to draw the ground plan. So by drawing, they started telling the story. So, and in some cases, some of them were not able to imagine their house in a kind of a drawing thing, but through the process they started associating. Like I met one village in one farmer's family. The parents were not ready to draw, but they asked their kids to draw, but the kids were not familiar. They born after the displacement, so they didn't know anything about the house. But then the mother was actually explaining to them, and they were just translating that into the drawing. Then the first time they saw their house ground plan actually. So this kind of interesting things also happen. And also this through this project, there were like people like there were stories which also made this book slightly different, because as I told you, because I was teaching in an area where the whole displacement happened. So as part of the local architecture history, we were actually documenting all the bungalow houses and colonial houses or courtyard houses belongs to the kind of elite communities, and which were in a kind of a process of dying. So I actually came with a mindset that in the end, I may be also having an interesting house plans in the end. But when I started this project, like first or second informant itself became a kind of a challenge. The one person came and told me that entire village is his house. He refused to draw his house. He drawn his actually his street, where there is a temple, well, other houses, shops, seashore, and all kinds of things. So he said resting places and things like that. So he refused to draw, which I found very challenging. Like in the beginning, I was looking for a house plan, but he never gave me a house plan. And second incident was one of my students. He lost his most of the family members in a tsunami and later on in the war. And he actually grown up in a kind of a LTT run orphanage. So for him, there is no memory about home or family. It's an orphanage. So he drawn his orphanage actually. So the third one was a Muslim vendor, he actually was not living in a kind of his own space, but he was expelled by the LTT and he returned. So he told me that he didn't have a house to draw, but he has a story to tell about home. So what I did was I documented his story, but there was no house plan. So there's one story without the house plan. So if you look at the book, this is a structure of the book. It's starting. So it is having four related document. The first page is my response to that story which they gave as a drawing. So second page is a kind of an architecturally mediated drawing in a kind of a transparent sheet. Because they have drawn their they have drawn their house plan according to their own thing. Then I made it as a kind of, it's looked like a measure drawing or architectural drawing with an assistance of computer. So the original drawings look like this actually. And at the end of the drawing, you can see there is a little extract from the story, so that you can relate the drawing and the story. So this was the structure of the book. Just before, so this is a kind of a, so this how this whole project is came out, and so this was a kind of a document which actually also talking about what kind of an emotional loss or a spatial loss actually happening, and also what kind of space making and how also the space and the place actually change through displacement and things like that. I think we can talk more when we have a kind of discussion, but just to get a kind of a little flavor of the stories, I'll read little stories before closing my presentation. There's one story talking like this. My village is in Pungudadevu. I was a small child when we were displaced in 1990. We walked nearly 15 kilometers to reach Jaffna. My family members carried household things that were portable. Since I was so small, they told me to carry my pet puppy. I carried him because he was too small to walk that distance. A few days after we reached Jaffna, the puppy died. Then another story. We got notice to leave our village without delay because the advancement of government troops. My grandfather could not bear it. He died that same day. We left the village immediately after his body was cremated. It's hard. These stories from Toronto. It is hard to nurture a jasmine creeper in a heavy winters in Toronto. I covered the plant with a blanket and kept inside the house. Last summer, it yielded 4 flowers. Their fragrance brought me back my Jaffna house. Yeah, this is the last one. We had to leave our house because of the advance of our troops in 1990. My father carefully locked the doors and brought all the keys with him with hope of return. Now almost 30 years have gone by, and my father passed away a few years back without seeing his house. We still have the key of the house, even though it and my father no longer exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanaathanan. That was very lovely. I think what you also bring is a very important coordinate you kind of bring in the idea of memory as a coordinate of thinking of space. And really sort of very interestingly, what that does is that it also tells us that the home is an imagined space, you know, and how, I mean, also sort of going back to what we were presenting before, that in some ways, I think it's sort of this idea of a cartographic imagination that in some ways created a kind of propertied idea of space, which also then leads to this idea of violence, of claiming somebody else's space, you know, and so in that sense, I was very intrigued by this idea of people actually drawing floor plans, you know, as floor plans, as this idea of claiming that sort of property. But then those 3 other people that you kind of narrated, people who could not draw the floor plans because their imaginations of home were not contained by that sort of container logic of space, right? That who refused to draw the idea that the village was the home for someone, or this idea of that the orphanage was the home for someone, or this idea of the person who was that there was no home to draw them, right? So in some ways, almost this kind of ironic situation, right? Like on the one hand, what is then that home that is imagined, and what happens if you reverse the logics? If you reverse the logics of not having to think of home through the container idea, would there be a more egalitarian society that we could then build from really kind of looking at more fuzzy logics of space, of ideas of sharing, of ideas of claims, the ideas of kind of what Sara presented, this idea of an infrastructure that gets built through more communitarian logics, which create egalitarian spaces, or also what Rasel presented to us was really this kind of irony of the modern project, right? Where we are creating, every time he said this was a housing project that comes in, there's the infrastructure project that comes in. And what that does is kind of removes, starts creating kind of consolidated boundaries between land, water, ideas of private ownership. And in some ways, what that does is all the ideas of life and living that in some ways, produce space are somehow limited to that idea of a contained propertied space. So what then would it mean to kind of think differently of space itself, right? What are some of the structural logics through which you rethink space? I think will be really important for us to imagine, in the South Asian context, and which is exactly why the idea of going back to thinking of a modern project perhaps is something that we cannot go to, right? I think that's something that is becoming more and more apparent. But I'd like y'all, any of you to reflect on maybe any of the other presentations, because this is not the spirit of this conversation is not that we are moderators. I think it'll be really nice if anyone is able to kind of bring in coordinates from somebody else's presentation that they think can inflect some of their own thinking. Anyone?
I wanted to thank everyone, firstly Rupali and Dipti, for organizing this and for introducing me to this beautiful work that was presented today from both the speakers. I mean, so much of it resonates with everything that I've lived in and seen, that I feel like it really just transcends geographies in terms of where this condition exists, and the way the sensitivities almost to which you were thinking about them, thinking about the authenticity of working through them. It's just really beautiful. So I'm really glad I was part of this discussion. Thank you.
Shanaathanan, Rasel.
Well, thank you everyone. I'm really excited, and also I would like to thank Rupali and the School of Environmental and Architecture for introducing me again with Mr. Shanaathanan, because we know each other before, and with Sara, Anwar. And yeah, it's a kind of eye-opening for me because you guys introduced me with the work of Sara, Anwar, and the book project of Mr. Shanaathanan. I think it will help me to rethink so many things. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Rupali, it's a very interesting, I enjoyed other two presentations, and also it's well connected, I find. And especially the last one about the Bangladesh landscape, which I found the landscape. I was just looking at the landscape in the painting, in the photographs, and against the building, the construction he was showing, or the so-called city or a modern infrastructure development and all these things. So the whole, the contradiction we can see, it's become a kind of very surreal kind of a location. It's not only happening in Dhaka. It's happening all over. So, but when you present, actually, we were looking at something slightly different. It's very it's like a very harmonized kind of structures. But in these two presentations, I find it's like they are uprooted from somewhere and placed somewhere. So it's like you feel a kind of an innate tension in that building environment and the natural environment. And the Bangladeshi one is like whether he's consciously capturing that or unconsciously it's coming, but you can see that ruinous or kind of a decay of a kind of a natural environment. It's like it's become a totally kind of slightly become unlivable. He talked about that, but it's like it's very much visible in that kind of thing. So the beautiful water bodies reflecting all these kind of things. It's a kind of a dreamland, but it's like it's no more look like that because the constructions are so ugly, unplanned. It's the water loggage and all kinds of things. So I think that actually is something we have to think about in terms of space and what kind of belongingness we can produce to the people when we talked about it. Like in my presentation, I was talking about how war and displacement forcefully uprooted people and all these things, but how development and other kinds of things actually bringing the same kind of issues, the same kind of feelings actually. Because like a post-war situation we are facing, that I find war is much better than the post-war, because it's like the amount of displacement happening, it's like multiple levels, like other kinds of decolonizations and modernization and all kinds of things happening. So yeah.
No, I absolutely right, Shanaathanan. I think that's where it's important to understand how you frame the arguments, because often what happens is the frameworks of lack, if I may say, the frameworks of lack lead to the opposite of it. They lead to a kind of developmentalist logic, which actually lands up being even more violent in many cases. And which is why I think, like, where do you locate that frame of seeing? Where do you are you located at another topological level, or are you embedded in the frameworks where perhaps you start seeing things differently? And I think that's something that we've been focusing on a lot, because sometimes when you see things from afar, what looks like poverty, and if you look closer, that poverty has many more nuances. It may not be poverty, but it may be another way of living life, right? And so that, because the developmental logic otherwise kicks in place, when you frame it in this kind of sense of loss, which is why, I know you called it harmonious. It's perhaps not harmonious, but there is a kind of friction that is operating. And how do you learn to see that friction, and how do you learn to see it much more closely than from a distance point of view? So I think that's something which will be it's a complicated question for us to, particularly in South Asia, to start developing and thinking of, because otherwise the opposite of that, it lead to a modern project which is even more violent, which is absolutely what you said, that war was better than development in many ways, right? So yeah. So okay, I don't know, I know it's been like already, it's 8:15 already, but it's a complex question, and I'm glad, Shanaathanan, you brought this. I don't think it's something that can end here, and we are definitely going to be in touch with all of you, and it'll be nice to, it's not something that ends on a panel for an hour and a half, but we hope that this discussion continues further, as well as, as all of us kind of think through some of these questions. And with that, I'll just sum up the entire day in like maybe 2 lines, because we're already way off time. We were supposed to end at 8 o'clock, but I think because it also ties up many of the questions that we've been, addressing. You've seen the poster, all of you. I know, it's difficult to attend the entire conference in a Zoom space. We could have, traditionally, we would have had a physical, we would have invited all of you to India. We would have had a nice place, gone for, some drinks at the end of the day. But this is like, we've had since morning, since 10:15, we've started this. And we've had a series of very, very interesting discussions. The first one kind of looking at the space of the urban, and how is the kind of space of the urban produced through emerging logics, where you cannot, no longer can you think of the city as a kind of contained space, but all kinds of contradictions that are forming the city. And it reflects a lot on what we've been talking about here as well. And so then what are the logics through which you think of, if you can't think through, if the developmental lens kind of, cleans things out, what does it mean to kind of, think of other ways of thinking of futures, is something that the first panel spoke about. The second panel was also very, very interesting. It brought in this idea of thinking of drawing as a way of thinking of space. And again, it connects very much to this panel, because it, in some ways, it talks about how our ways of imagining space are embedded in our logics of drawing. So when the British were drawing in a particular way, they were imagining space and congealing space in a particular way, right? When the Tombu was made, the register of land records is made, you are already kind of imagining space in a particular way, which is a contained logic, which is actually creating all the structural violence that otherwise other forms of life and living would not produce, right? So what are our ways of then drawing to kind of open up other logics of life and living that are much more egalitarian? I think that's where the second panel was starting to think of what are other sensorial logics, other ways of drawing and imagining space. The third one was on that looked at the idea of again environment, but what does it mean to think of environment again through more embedded logics of life living? What does it mean to kind of rethink? Because again, we've in both architectural terms, in planning terms, we've also kind of there's either the catastrophic idea that climate change is going to change everything, and then you kind of produce all kinds of plans to then mitigate this, which is out there in the future. But what happens to the meantime life and living, and how do people actually negotiate these landscapes, not through the kind of violence of the plan, but through kind of everyday embedded logics, is what that this panel was looking at very carefully. What are other epistemes of thinking? How do you learn from the forest, for example, as opposed to kind of looking at other modern logics of life and living, is what the environmental panel opened up. And the third, the last panel just before us, was looking at material ecologies in interesting ways. And they were interested in the space between the digital and the material. And they said, if there are, your kind of big data is taking over the world, algorithmic logics are taking over, then what does it mean to think of errors and glitches that then produce other kind of possibilities, which perhaps are again more egalitarian in ways that they don't kind of work with assembly lines and the idea of a kind of logic which is out there, but more sort of again embedded logics of life and living. So all of these panels in some ways came together to really think of how we might kind of start living in the future. What are the logics through which we are producing space? So I think all of them were really interesting, and we'll share the links of the panel so all of you can also see them at your own time. But yeah, I'll end there, and I hope that all of us can stay in touch in the future as we think together on some of these questions. So thank you all for coming. And yeah, this is like end of the day. It's almost dinner time, I think, for everyone here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.